love your writing, I mean. It's just that, well, who am I to give criticism to someone like you? I mean, it's just that I love The Stand. It's brilliantly written, but that scene, Stephen, that scene where that guy puts the gun up Trash Can Man's butt. Why did you have to write that scene, Stephen? It's forever burned into my mind now, Stephen. I've read so many other things and I can't get it out of my head. Why did you put that in there? It wasn't in the original version of The Stand. Why did you put it back into the uncut version? Why did I have to read about Trash Can Man getting a gun up his butt? You could have just kept it out, Stephen. But no, you wanted me to read that. You wanted me to read that. It's some sick thing that you do, Stephen. Why did you write about the cock-a-doodle gun going in his cock-a-doodle butt? But it's okay. I still love you. I mean, your mind, your stories.
It comes in paints?
Oh.
I'm getting one.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking through that tomfoolery. But today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite authors, Stephen King. Specifically, we're going to be doing my top 5 Stephen King books of all time. And we're going to be drinking Nightmare on Brett Raspberry. Is a demonic sour on many facets during its transformation to the sour side. You get the gist. It's a sour. What I love right here. It has an ABV of, I don't know if you can see that or not, but it has an ABV of 9.666. So, it's fitting for talking about one of the greatest horror writers of all time. Definitely smells like a sour. That is tart. It's good. Okay. Let's get into the books. So, Stephen King, probably my favorite writer, I would say. So he's the writer that I've read the most books. He's the writer, as soon as I start recording, I forget how to talk. He's the writer that I've read the most books by, but he's also the writer that I've DNF'd the most books by, which means that I stopped reading at some point. I feel like both of those are a compliment, though, because even though I quit reading one of his books, I'm still kind of always looking forward to the next time I pick one up, but they're not all winners. But the 5 that I'm talking to you about today are absolutely winners. Each one of these 5 books is a 5 out of 5. So the first one is actually just an honorable mention because I couldn't exclude this. Carrie. It's the first one that he published. It's the first one that I read by Stephen King. And it was a book that... Sorry, let's get that hammer out of here. First book by Stephen King that I read, and kind of shows him flexing his muscles at suspense. Not just like horror. I don't know if Carrie is really a horror novel so much as it is suspenseful. And that's something that King does really well. And when he does it well, he does it amazingly. That's my favorite Stephen King, is when he's doing suspense. Now that they've got Carrie out of the way, we'll start with number 1, not number 1. We'll start with number 5, which is On Writing. Kind of like his memoir, kind of like his how to write. I picked it up mostly for the how to write side of things, but I would recommend this book to, I mean, if you're looking for a how to write book, this book is great. It taught me the 2,000 words a day. Goes into basically how, as a writer, if you want to finish books, you need to have a work ethic with your books. And setting a minimum word count a day is fantastic work ethic. But not only that, if you're just a Stephen King fan, I highly recommend this book because he goes into a lot of his other books and his stories, and he talks about the inspirations for the stories. He talks about what he was doing when he was writing them, where he was in his life. So I wouldn't recommend this as your first Stephen King book, but after you've read a bunch of his stuff, and if you like him, this gives a whole bunch of like inside stories and behind the scenes stuff that you rarely ever get with writers. Absolutely, this is in my top 5. It's just so rare that you get something like that from one of your favorite writers. You get to see the thought process or where an idea came from, or how long it took him to write something. Just so many interesting anecdotes about his stories and his experiences writing and his method of writing. The writing advice in it is also solid. He talks about the importance of characters and focusing on the character and letting the character do what you want. Stephen King doesn't outline or plot his books before he writes them. He just kind of wings it when he writes it, and it talks about his specific writing methods, and it's fantastic to learn from him, especially if you're writing and you want to learn some tools to get better at. If you want to put some tools in your toolbox, that's a little metaphor from inside this book, in your writing toolbox to improve your writing, I highly recommend On Writing. If you're a Stephen King fan and you haven't read On Writing, I highly recommend it just because it's such a treat to learn about him and the stories behind the stories. Number 5. Number 4. Whew. Ugh, that is tart. It's good though. Pet Sematary. So, Pet Sematary is King just doing creepy really well, but also doing fantastic characterization and atmosphere, doing atmosphere really well. So the story of Pet Sematary is a doctor who moves into a new town for a new job with his wife and 2 kids, and one of the kids' pets dies, and one of his neighbor friends takes him out to the local pet cemetery, which is just where all the local neighborhood kids for decades have buried their pets. But then he goes deeper into the woods and he shows them a mystical pet cemetery that can bring the family cat back to life. And the cat does come back to life, but it's not the same cat that it was. And then later on in the book, tragedy strikes, and Stephen King, he develops his characters to such a significant level that generally when something awful happens, it's very impactful. And when the suspense builds, it's very impactful. And this is some of the great, spooky and suspenseful Stephen King, and also the great characterization of Stephen King. Fantastic character development, fantastic suspense. That makes for a great Stephen King book. Not to mention, he kind of builds in this, I think it's Native American folklore, mythology, spooky ghost story stuff. But yeah, spooky, suspenseful, good characters, good Stephen King novel. Pet Sematary. Okay, number 3, The Shining, which is actually the 3rd book that he published. I bet you know the story of The Shining from the movie. This is one of his more famous and more popular books. Why I love The Shining so much, why it's number 3 on this list, is because, in my opinion, Stephen King can do 2 things in his books very, very well. First, an isolated group of characters in a specific terrifying situation, and he will keep them isolated the whole book. And you would think that would make for a short book, but often it doesn't. The Shining. This version is almost 700 pages, but the way Stephen King writes and the way he builds suspense and horror in his books, they're fast reads. They're never dull. He's always focused. He does character so well. The character that he builds is immediately interwoven into the suspense and the horror and the creepy and the scary of the book and the situation that he puts. I mean, in On Writing, he talks about, he specifically mentions The Shining, and he talks about how when he comes up with an idea, it isn't, a whole plot that he comes up with. He likes to think of his books as situational ideas. So the idea for The Shining was family stuck in haunted hotel, and you got a dude battling with alcoholism who wants to write a play. You got a little boy with psychic powers. This is also, side note, talking about the psychic powers. Stephen King has this kind of like Lovecraft, Marvel Cinematic Universe style, interconnected interwovenness with all of his books, and you kind of start to notice that, and the more you read of him, the more you kind of start to notice that. Specific characters will turn up in other books. Like specifically, Dan Halloran in this book turns up in It. That's not a spoiler, it's just a little Easter egg, but they are filled throughout his books. And this kind of starts to build his mythos. I mean, really it starts in Carrie, but, it starts significantly in this one, especially with the concept of The Shining, that I believe that plays a part in lots of his books. But, so, why this is so fantastic is because Stephen King can take 3 characters in an isolated area, develop them really, really, really well, so that you care about all the characters, even the ones that are messed up, even the ones that, you would think would be the villains. Like Jack Torrance in this book is a relatable guy. He's flawed and he's got stuff wrong with him, but he's relatable. So anyways, he does tight groups of characters in an isolated space, in a scary environment, in a scary situation so well. He can build the suspense and the terror really, really well with just a couple of characters in a creepy situation. And The Shining is a fantastic example of that. Number 2, The Stand. This is widely considered his best book. This is the complete and uncut version. I don't know if you really need the uncut version. I think both versions are fantastic. But if you want the uncut version, go for it. It is 1,439 pages. I think this is the longest book that I've ever read, but it is fantastic. So what I was saying before, there's 2 things that Stephen King can do really, really well. This is a great example of the second thing that he can do really, really well. So the first was small group of characters in an isolated environment, building suspense through that. This is an example, The Stand is an example of him doing a huge cast of characters on an epic scale and building suspense in a massive environment. So The Stand to me can kind of be divided into 2 parts. The first part of it, you've got a experimental government-created super flu that accidentally escapes and wipes out like 95% of the population of the entire planet. Ew. Just kidding, it's good. Just hurt. So in The Stand, you got 2 parts. The book focuses on a large cast of characters that are the survivors of the flu. And in the first part of the book, you see the flu escape, kill everybody, and you see these characters deal with a post-apocalyptic scenario. And in that, you have some of the really creepy horror Stephen King, but also some of the great characterizations. One character in particular, Nick Andros, in this book, he's a deaf mute, and he has got to be one of my favorite characters, not only of Stephen King, but like of fiction. Like, I love Nick Andros. He's a great character. But you also got some of his creepiest scenes of all time. Like, there's one guy who was in a prison cell at the time that the flu got out. You see him stuck there after everyone's dead for chapters, and it was one of the most scary and disturbing things that I've read. But then you also have that scene from the beginning. That's only in the uncut version, that scene that I was talking about, if you remember. But then the second half of the book is all about after the survivors have met each other, and you got the bad guys kind of joining them in Las Vegas, and you got the good guys joining in Boulder, Colorado. And Stephen King says in On Writing that when he came up with The Stand, he wanted to write his own kind of big, epic Lord of the Rings set in America. And imagine Stephen King's creepy, suspenseful weirdness, and Stephen King's great characterization, and Stephen King's like love of, you know, old Americana and like weird Christian apocalyptic mythology, and you got The Stand. It's fantastic. It's amazing. There's a reason that a lot of people think that it's his best, but long book. And drum roll for my number one favorite of all time. I should preface this. I have not read all of his books, so this list might change, but for right now, out of what I've read, my favorite of all time, Misery. This is another example of Stephen King taking a very, very small cast of characters in an isolated environment and cranking the suspense up to 11. I mean, this is like the whole book. This one, my version, 338 pages, so it's a pretty short for Stephen King standards. And he says in On Writing that he had started writing it longhand and had intended it to just be a short story or a novella. And, you know, he thought he had the ending figured out when he started it and all that, but it grew in the telling, and I mean, it turned into something that is just pure, suspenseful Stephen King goodness from beginning to end. I mean, I could read this book in one sitting, because the entire time from page 1, sentence 1, Umber 1, your number 1 fan. These sounds, even in the haze. I mean, from the very freaking beginning, this is a can't put it down, edge of your seat, nail-biting suspense. Small cast of characters, like most of the time it's just Paul Sheldon and Annie Wilkes. And they are both some of my all-time favorite King characters. I don't know if you've seen the movie. I think this also wins for my favorite Stephen King adaptation into movie. The movie's fantastic, but the book is so much, like, it's so much even better than the movie was. I could gush about this forever, but I don't want to spoil it. Just if you like suspenseful, just like, oh, like drive you crazy, what's gonna happen, I gotta get to the next page, the next page, the next page. This is like my favorite suspenseful story I've ever read. I love this book. Favorite Stephen King book. It's short, quick read. You kind of have to read it in one sitting just because it grabs you and it won't let go, and it's just so good. You probably know the story. Author Paul Sheldon gets in a car wreck, wakes up. He's being nursed by this lady, Annie Wilkes, who's his number 1 fan. She turns out to have a couple screws loose. It's so good. Just read Misery. That's a great entry Stephen King. I think it should be considered one of his best, but oh, who am I? Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for putting up with my tomfoolery. Thanks to Crooked Stave for making this delicious sour. So good. I'm just kidding. I like sours. I always have to make that face after I take a sip. But, yeah. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more book reviews or more top 5s, top 10s, whatever. This was fun to make, so I might make more of them in the future. If you got ideas for good ones, leave them in the comments. Anyways, like, comment, subscribe. See you guys in the next one.